So you notice today the nice shirt has come off. I'm into my nerdy jeans SharePoint Conference shirt. So this is a little bit rolling up the sleeves somewhat today. So apart from doing SharePoint training, I have a book out. That's the prize today for the best caveat, by the way. So look out for that one. But it's called The Heretic's Guide to Best Practices.
Okay, and my name is Michael Pisarek. I'm the founder of Dynamic Our Consulting and a SharePoint MVP. I grew up in Adelaide, but now live in Vancouver, Canada. My blog is up there. If you're one of the 20 or so people a month that visit it, thank you. If not, then it would be great if you would. If you want to get in contact with either of us, either follow us on Twitter, send us an email, or communicate with us somehow. We've actually got a couple of blog posts around different caveats and experiences that people have. So yeah, it would be good to add more to the pile. Paul.
Okay, so there's actually two definitions of caveat. So it depends on the one that Microsoft would prefer us to use, and then there's a real one. So we thought we'll give you the definition that Michael has to use. So let's. It's not caveats, it's considerations. Now, do you want to know what the real definition is? What the way you should come into SharePoint? That's kind of my starting point. So yes, so that's basically the perspective here is, and in fact, if you just go on to the next slide, I think we're not actually. It's not a dump on Microsoft talk. Yes, we'll have a little bit of fun at Microsoft's expense, but everyone does that. It's stress relief. But the whole point of this exercise is this is actually to save you time, money, and resources, because if you go down a road, you've made a logical assumption, and then the sort of logical edifice of that turned out to be something that was caveat prone, it can cause you a bit of grief. Has anyone ever experienced that? You've gone down a certain road, you've sort of found, oh, okay, we have to now go down that road, and then that path is equally as sucky as the one you went down. So this is really actually about saving you money, going with both eyes wide open, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Okay, and we have some contenders for the best caveats, and this is what we're going to cover in this session. Search refinements, document ID, SharePoint Workspace. A really popular one is managed metadata. For those of you that have used managed metadata, there's a couple of people laughing. I think one guy's crying over there already. You've probably seen some of the limitations. Document sets, external lists, and then user profile service, which works extremely well in all circumstances. So I'm going to start off with search refiners. Now, search refiners in search in SharePoint 2010 is essentially the little refinements that appear on the left-hand side of SharePoint search results, and they allow you to filter the search results that you receive. This is new to SharePoint 2010, and most organizations that I work with, and I do a lot of work with search, it's by far one of the most well-liked features, I guess, from an end-user perspective. It's generated from the list of search results that you receive, so you get very much like a Bing or Google or an eBay or an Amazon-like search experience, where you type in a search term, and then you can filter the search results on the left-hand side. So for instance, if we do a search, for example, behind me there on the left are all the search refinements that are generated. So I assume everyone's fairly familiar with what these are. Now, there's a couple of things that I found, and I'm talking about standard SharePoint search. So SharePoint Standard or SharePoint Enterprise. If you're using fast search, it's a little bit different. But the first thing is the refinements that get generated on that left-hand side are taken by default from the first 50 search results that appear. So if you do a search and you get back 10,000 results, the refinements that are generated are only generated from the first 50. All the categories and all the items are generated only from the first 50 results. Now, it can be really, really confusing to end users.
Well, result number 51 is a PDF. You will not see PDF in the list of refinements, even though you might have a whole number of PDFs in the result set.
Exactly. So we'll give you a bit of an example. As you can see, I've done a search for tailings. I've got 30,000 results, but on the left-hand side here, for each category, there's only 50. 50, 50, 50, 50. So this is the default out-of-the-box standard SharePoint experience. Now, what you can do, and this is something that's not commonly known, is that you can actually change how many refinements are going to be used to generate those refiners. And you can raise it from a value of 50 to a value of 500. You can put in as many values as you like, but it's only going to go up to 500. If you're using fast search, you have something called deep refinements, and you get all of the results set generated. To do this is really, really easy. You go into the refinement panel web part, and you change something called the accuracy index from 50 to 500. Now what happens in a little bit of a demo, I do a search. This is with 50. Okay, so by default, we've got 50. Now, if we change that to 500, look what happens, right? Now, we've got the exact same search term, but because we're taking the first 500 results to generate our refinements, we get a whole bunch more goodness there for our users. And a lot of users ask this, right? I've searched for all these documents. Why isn't it appearing in this filter panel on this left-hand side, this refinement panel? There's your answer. Now, there's a bit of a performance hit with that, but it's definitely a better user experience. So, change it from 50 to 500, you get more refinements generated. Does that make sense to people? Yep, awesome. Now, why that's not enabled out of the box, God only knows. There is a performance hit, so make sure you actually test that as well. Number 2, so by default in standard or enterprise SharePoint search, you get no counts displayed for your refinements either, right? If you implement SharePoint search, you have an out-of-the-box search site template, you're not going to get any of these counts. This is an example of a fast search page. I know it's a little bit blurry, where you actually get those counts. Another thing that's not commonly known is you actually can enable them in normal standard SharePoint search. So for instance, this is the out-of-the-box search experience. There's no counts there, as you can see. Now, this is a little bit nerdy. It's actually pretty simple to do. All you need to do is go into this filter category definition, add show counts equals counts, and then magically you get counts appearing.
Let me zoom that in, Michael.
Whoa.
Magic of zoom it.
There we go. Okay, super easy thing. It takes you maybe 2, 3, maybe 5 minutes if you're hungover. But it's a really easy thing to do, and it actually, from a usability perspective, it works really, really well. So there's all of them with all of our counts. Okay, document ID. Any questions about the search refiner stuff? Did people know that? Is that new information, or people knew that?
Sorry, what was the last thing you just changed?
The last thing, let's just go back here, is basically you add show counts equals count to each of the. So what this is, there's this filter category definition. It essentially defines which refiners are going to be shown. It's some crazy XML, so I'm not going to go through it. But it's all on my blog and on Paul's blog as well, so it's fairly simple to do. Okay, document ID. Does anyone use the document ID service in SharePoint 2010? One guy? Okay, that's good. Does everyone know what it is? No? Okay, excellent. So we'll go through it. The document ID service, once again, new feature of SharePoint 2010, does a couple of really nifty things. Essentially, it allows you to generate a unique ID for every document that you create on a per site collection basis. So what you can do now is if you need unique numbering, and in any ECM or records management scenario, you probably need a unique identifier for documents, you can turn this thing on, and you'll get a unique ID generated. The other thing that it does is that it can solve the problem of broken links. Now, if you know that if you send someone a link to a SharePoint document, it sends them a link to where the document is located. I'm sure you've been in that situation. You send someone a link, and the document moves. They try to click on the link from the email. They don't know where it is, and a whole bunch of madness ensues. If you send them this particular URL, what happens is that regardless of where the document is within SharePoint, they're always going to be able to retrieve the document, right? So it stops the issue of broken links. It's quite a nifty feature. The other thing as well is, does anyone use SharePoint 2010 for records management? Okay, poor people. One thing you can do as well, typically in a records management scenario, you may be working in a document in one site collection, and then once you finish with it, you take that document and you move it across site collection boundaries to a record center. Okay? Now what happens, as I said before, is that since the document has a unique ID, you should be able to find it, right, via document ID. But once again, there's a little bit of a caveat in this as well. What happens behind the scenes is that there's a little bit of a box, and this is this find document by ID box. And I can enter in the ID of any document within here, And the great thing is it doesn't take me to a search results page. It simply brings up that document straight away, which is pretty handy. It's a nice little time saver instead of going to search, triggering search, looking at the search results and clicking on it. It will just bring the document straight up. Now, if I'm in that situation where I've moved the document, right, across a site collection, and I try to do this, but I can't find the document. What you need to do, and trust me, I've had users call me and complain saying SharePoint's lost my document, I'm never going to use it again. Now what actually happens is that you need to wait for the next incremental crawl to run, because the way that it works is by default it searches for the document within the current site collection, then it tries to use search. But if you're in that gap in between running an incremental crawl, and it's usually 20 minutes, it's not going to be able to find it. Okay, so it's a fairly common scenario.
Who's used SharePoint Workspace with managed metadata? Because we're going to get to that in a little while. Okay. For those of you that don't know SharePoint Workspace, it's basically, this is actually Microsoft's definition of it, straight out of TechNet, and you can read it for yourself. It provides a client for Microsoft Share. It's an offline client. Who used Groove? Right? It's just it's Groove badged with SharePoint with some better support from the old version. But it's a client, it's offline synchronization. So it's very good, for example, in Western Australia mining scenarios. It's very handy when you're off in the middle of nowhere with your corpus of documents on the end of a poor comm satellite link, for example. Now, here is, Michael and I have put a slight change to the definition. So here is our definition of what we think it is. So we've just changed the third line. So we've said SharePoint Workspace provides a client for SharePoint Server that under highly improbable circumstances enables real-time synchronization of desktop content with SharePoint libraries and lists. So here is why. We'll give you a couple of examples. So here is a question. If a list has managed metadata fields on it, can you take it offline with SharePoint?
SharePoint Workspace.
Yeah. Sorry, SharePoint Workspace. What do you think the answer is? Probably not.
Who's for yes? Raise your hands. Who's for no? Raise your hands.
And which consultant's got that niggling feeling now in the back of their mind? The spider senses are starting to tingle at this point. Okay. So, well, guess what the answer is? The classic SharePoint answer. Now, let's just do a quick, just while I'm thinking about it. So, it depends is number one. The short answer is yes, is kind of my one. There's yes, but. Does anyone else have any standard answers to those sort of questions? Or is it? Yeah, sometimes. Okay.
Yeah. My favorite is in theory, it can.
Okay. So let me give you a scenario. So here is a managed metadata column called project. And if you have a look closely, I'm not even going to attempt to do the zoom, but I'll use Mr. Pointy. Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're like Adriana. It's project, code, and then sub-project. So you see it says project A and then it's stage. Sorry, project and stage. So we have 3 columns and we have a list with 3 items in it. So we synchronize that into SharePoint Workspace. If that column was just a regular column that's optional, if you have a look closely there, there's the items and there's our managed metadata, there's our project. But look here, you see how that bit is grayed out? Only the title field can we edit. So there's my item, I've clicked on it, and I want to go and change it from stage 1 to stage 2. It's grayed out. Now, that's annoying, but I guess it's an optional field. What do you think happens if that field is marked as mandatory? Any ideas?
That's what the logical person would think.
Ah. That's what you get.
Right, you actually get an error.
SharePoint Workspace has detected an error in the configuration of this list. So basically, here's what that... Now, if you've used managed metadata with Office 2010, some of you might have noticed that there's a tick box inside document libraries you can tick. In the File Open dialog box of Word and Excel and the Office apps, you can now navigate by metadata. So you can escape folders. So you would think to yourself, oh, well, fantastic, let's mark that as mandatory. But then if you ever want to take it offline, that's what's going to happen. So basically, if a managed metadata field is marked as mandatory, it precludes you from using SharePoint Workspace to take it offline. Now, but let's keep going. Michael actually went and checked this out and made a list. So just beyond that issue of the managed metadata column, there are certain SharePoint list types that can't be synchronized anyway. So you might, if you think about a typical, say, a team portal or a project portal, you may well have some of these, such as calendar. Can that sync? No. So form libraries, slide libraries, blog sites, surveys, all of that sort of stuff. So there's quite a big list there. So watch out. Just don't assume that every single type of data or every form of data sitting in SharePoint sites can be synchronized offline.
Calendars and events can be done using Outlook, though.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, well, actually, documents can be done using Outlook too, as well as tasks and a whole lot of other things. Very true. But I guess the one thing that Workspace, or I have to check actually whether Workspace still supports it, Groove did a peer-to-peer thing, where if you were offline in a remote location, it would synchronize off your peer before it would go back to the central server, which enabled a more efficient use of bandwidth. That was the value proposition of Groove. So I liked, that was my colleague here put that. Now Michael's full of these. I haven't worked out what to call it yet. Michaelisms. I need to come up with a name for Michael anecdotes because there's some really good ones.
I've said a lot of stuff that I regret saying to customers, to be perfectly honest with you. You know, and they're simple things. I mean, it's, you know, well, of course you can take a calendar offline. You should be able to take it offline with SharePoint Workspace. It just makes logical sense. And unfortunately, it's not always the case, hence for this talk.
So now again, do you think I'm finished? No. Oh, but there's more. How about this one? I'm going to give you, we're going to paint a scenario here. So, if you've ever made a site column, we have made a site column, a mild-mannered site column called mild-mannered site column, and we made it a yes or no, all right? We then added that site column to a regular, out-of-the-box, boring old document library, okay? And so if you look closely to the right, Adriano, I need you for a second. There is our little site column. We then create a custom list, and with nothing in it but a title column, and we add the same column to it. So you've got a document library with a mild-mannered site column, and you have a list with a mild-mannered site column. So here's the thing. The list, you can synchronize it offline, and you could go into that list and create a new item in SharePoint Workspace while you're offline. And when you sync back to SharePoint, it will commit that back. With a document library, you can't. Yeah, the comment was that strange. So now Mike's got an interesting story to tell. So we thought, in honour of his experience, I mean, Clippy's legendary, and we thought Clippy needs to come back. So there's an interesting story to this.
So my story is I work with a large mining company based out of, large engineering company based out of Vancouver. And what they do, they're a geotechnical company, so they go to all remote locations in the world, and they'll go and they'll drill cores. And essentially they get a whole bunch of data. And what we wanted to do is they type in this data in this Word document and they upload it to this document library, and they add additional metadata columns to that particular library. So we were talking with them, and you know, the bandwidth in the Dominican Republic is very, very poor. It's probably worse than dial-up. So the idea was that we were going to use SharePoint Workspace to take the library offline. They go out into the field, they put in all their data, they upload the documents to SharePoint Workspace, they fill in the metadata, and at the end of the day, they drop off their laptops in this core shack that they have, they open it up, and it magically syncs back to the main SharePoint server, and everyone's happy. Now, I ran into the same issue, right? Because I actually only tested it with a list item. I'm like, well, if it works for a list item, this obviously should work for a document library. And of course, when they're calling me from the Dominican Republic and the phone call is really bad, I'm like, you guys are crazy. I'm sure that this must work. And it didn't.
SharePoint consultant mistake number one.
Exactly.
Quote unquote, I'm sure this must work.
And it didn't. So what I did is, if you've ever rung Microsoft support, there's actually a support line that you call. And there's different levels of support, I guess you could say, within Microsoft. So you got the level 1 people, which is outsourced, and they ask you a whole bunch of details. And then you keep kind of heckling them until they finally route you to the people that even know what SharePoint Workspace is. So what I did is, after 24 hours, I got through to level 4 support, right? So these are the people that actually might be on the product team, or they're pretty close proximity to the product team. And they said, we have the perfect answer for you in this scenario. And I'm like, great, I'm going to save face. So their answer was this, right? Their answer is, well, don't use a document library to store documents. Use a custom list and just attach those things as attachments. Now, I've dealt with a lot of interesting, I guess, approaches to storing documents, but this wasn't good at all. And it's kind of the examples that people see. This is a blatantly bad workaround for a SharePoint Workspace issue. And when I asked them how they came up with this sort of thing, they said, well, it just makes sense. A lot of the people that work at Microsoft don't necessarily use the product very often in a real-world scenario, which was shown. So that's my story of woe.
Okay. So how does everyone feel about that one so far? Yeah. So now let's talk about Mr. Managed Metadata. So now who has had a crack at Managed Metadata and backed off from it? I'm just curious. Hands up. So who's actually using Managed Metadata now? So I should say, actually, I have a client in Sydney who's actually made fantastic use of Managed Metadata, a property developer. So it's one of these things where, provided under certain circumstances, it is a fantastic solution, and it's been brilliant for these guys. But having said that, it's not there are certain issues. Now, who knows about the InfoPath one? Yeah, a few hands will go up because this is a common one that's nailed a lot of people. So
actually, before we go on, do people know what Managed Metadata is? Is everyone aware?
Okay, there's a few shaking of the head, so that's worth
going about. Okay, so once again, new feature in SharePoint 2010. Managed Metadata essentially allows me to define a taxonomy of options, a taxonomy of terms, and have them available across anywhere within SharePoint. In 2007, it was a major issue because what happened, you could only define options and terms at the site collection level. You couldn't have this central hub or repository of terms that you can use. Now, Managed Metadata gets past these problems. So, for instance, once again, we'll go back to the project example. I may want to have a whole bunch of different options that people tag a particular piece of content with. This is a document. This is something for approval, or whatever else. I can set up a centralized group of options in Managed Metadata and have them and those terms reused across anywhere within the SharePoint environment. Now, there's a couple of other cool features. You get some type ahead functionality as well, and you can reuse terms, and they're used for refinements as well. But it's one of those things that SharePoint sorely needed, I guess, this centralized store of terms. And it was really, really widely celebrated at the launch of SharePoint 2010.
And actually, who's used the tagging in 2010? You see the like it and the comments? That's writing it to Managed Metadata behind the scenes. So here's the thing. Another feature of 2010, which was great, was you could now take a standard SharePoint form and go into InfoPath and edit it. Now, in 2007, you didn't have that luxury. You had to hack around with SharePoint Designer or do some crazy JavaScript things. Now, you could open up an InfoPath. You can change the behavior of the forms. You could even do cascading lists, where you go choose a state choice of city. All of that sort of stuff is now possible, except when you have a Managed Metadata column. So if you've added a Managed Metadata column to a list, and you say, I'd like to open it in InfoPath, please, you will get this message. The following fields in SharePoint is not supported, and you can't edit it with InfoPath. So basically, if you choose to use Managed Metadata, you're then precluded from using InfoPath as a means to customize the form. If you have gone down the leave form route where you've created an InfoPath form and you've published it to SharePoint using form services, you actually have the same problem. The Managed Metadata fields will not render. The irony is it's only for the web-based version of InfoPath. The actual native InfoPath does support Managed Metadata. The reason I know that is because the document information panel, if you've ever seen Word 2010, that is actually InfoPath behind the scenes, and Managed Metadata is available and promoted there. So it was something they had, I believe, the backstory is I think there were just issues with it around the time. It was sort of slated, but because of various issues, they took it off. But that was a bit of a, well, in fact, I'll show you some of the comments. We compiled a few from today. So the first one's quite nice. So there's this TechNet discussion forum that's been going on for how long? Pretty much since 2000.
Pretty much a couple of years.
Yeah.
So TechNet is the public Microsoft forum where you can ask questions, or in this case, post your feedback to Microsoft around what you think of their particular products. And the issue of not being able to use Managed Metadata or InfoPath has obviously caused a few people quite a lot of strain, I guess you would say.
Because I mean, if you think about it, you've made an investment in coming up with a taxonomy, and you're using it within your Office applications when you're tagging and saving documents. It makes logical sense that you would want to use that same taxonomy within forms. Yeah, after all, it's similar terms, it's similar metadata requirements. But so you're precluded from doing it. There are some workarounds that have been suggested, but they're really ugly. It's in that you start to get into that world of InfoPath where you suddenly realise you've dug a deep hole and you've got in deeper than you really wanted to. There's a couple of other things with managed metadata while we're here. If you haven't upgraded to Office 2010, forget about it. It's not supported in the 2007 Office client. And you'll notice there that, in fact, there's managed metadata forms. It just doesn't show any controls for you to actually put any data into. So if you were going to do it, you'd have to do a double hop, upload the document, then go back in and edit the properties.
In 2003, it won't even open. So just don't try.
Yeah.
So it doesn't open.
It can't be managed metadata can't be edited in Datasheet view, right? It'll be viewed, but now you can't see it very well here, but you see some kind of surreal hashes and stuff like that. You may not be aware, the managed metadata column is actually just a lookup column dressed up with some extra features to do with the managed metadata. And so it actually suffers from some of the same restrictions as a traditional SharePoint lookup column. So no Datasheet view. Now, if you want to work around this issue of, well, if you don't have Datasheet view, how could we do bulk edits for a whole lot of documents? And really, there's apart from one thing in 2010 that is actually quite nice is the ability to have now default values at a folder level as well as a library level. So you drop something in, it just gets all of the defaults, and a subfolder can have a different value to a different folder. If you're not familiar with document sets, that's a really ugly workaround, that one. But we're going to, Michael's going to speak about document sets in a little while, so we'll return to that one. But I almost feel dirty about putting that one up there as a workaround. And there's something in SharePoint 2010 called inline editing, which also has some interesting surreal aspects to it as well, to do with Ajax and refresh, and you know, you click one thing and go to the next one, and it hasn't saved the previous one. So some interesting user experience type stuff. But basically, as we've summed up there, this is one of those nasty ones where there is no particularly easy or elegant way to deal with these issues at this point. Here's another one. For those of you that have created libraries and used views and group by and sort by, you cannot do things like, I would like a managed metadata column, anything that begins with A, or anything that contains the letter E. Not going to work. More is actually, again, it's to do with the lookup column. Behind the scenes, when you look at a managed metadata column and you see the value in your browser on the screen, behind the scenes it's really not storing that actual value, it's storing a reference to the term in the central taxonomy, which is where that problem stems from. That's the nice friendly message you get there too. You can't use it in calculated columns as well. I think, yeah, lookup columns have that same issue, so don't do any logic or any logic stuff with it. Workflow. There's one that we didn't mention in there. If you were to use SharePoint Designer Workflow and make business logic decisions, so someone might have tagged, I don't know, a status, or you've got a taxonomy which is to do with project status. If you want to have a workflow that then makes a logic decision, well, if status equals this, go and do this, it can be done, but it's really tricky because the raw data behind the scenes, it's not just the term. It's an ID, hash. If I recall, it's a GUID in there. But anyway, so it's not as straightforward as it might seem.